The deed and the strangers. The wind cut sharp across the plains that morning, carrying with it the dry smell of sagebrush and the faint iron tang of old dust. Miles of open land stretched in every direction, broken only by the rise of far-off hills and the occasional black silhouette of a hawk turning slow circles overhead. In that endless expanse rode a man named Caleb Harris, a drifter whose boots had known the mud of Kansas cattle towns, the red soil of Texas trails, and the gun smoke of more than one half-forgotten skirmish. He had spent years moving from job to job, place to place, with nothing more than a saddlebag, a weathered coat, and the kind of tired eyes that told the story of someone who had seen too much and yet found too little worth holding on to. But in his pocket that day he carried something he hadn't owned before, something that tethered him, at least on paper, to the soil beneath his horse's hooves. A deed. Signed and sealed by a banker in Cheyenne, the document marked him the rightful owner of 200 acres of frontier land, complete with a farmhouse, a barn, and the promise of a new start. He had purchased it cheap from a man desperate to leave. A man who had spoken little but whose eyes had darted nervously as if there was more to the land than he dared admit. Caleb, too weary to question fortune when it fell into his lap, had taken the papers and set out with a simple dream. Quiet, work-filled days, a place to rest his bones, and perhaps, in time, someone to share it with. As his horse crested a small ridge, Caleb caught sight of the farm for the first time. The house stood square against the prairie wind, its paint long peeled to gray, its windows staring blank and empty. A weathered barn leaned slightly to one side, its roof patched in places where storms had torn shingles away. Fences sagged under years of neglect, and the well pump sat silent beside the house like a forgotten relic. It was not the vision of prosperity he might have hoped for, but it was his. And in a land where men often lived and died with nothing more than the dust in their pockets, ownership, no matter how modest, was a treasure worth fighting for. He spurred his horse down the slope, the hooves thudding softly on the earth. The closer he drew, the stronger the unease settled in his chest. Something wasn't right. The farm was not abandoned, as the seller's nervous words had led him to believe. There was smoke curling from the chimney, faint but steady, a ribbon of gray rising into the bright morning air. And then as he pulled rein before the porch, he saw movement. The door opened slow, and from the shadows of the house stepped a figure, then another, then a third. Caleb blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks in the hard sunlight. The three women who stood before him were unlike any he had ever seen. They were tall, remarkably so, each one a head and more above his 6-foot frame. Their shoulders broad, their limbs strong, their presence commanding as though the very earth bent subtly to their weight. Yet there was no brutishness in them. They carried themselves with a grace that unsettled him more than raw power would have. Their hair, though unkempt by the wind, fell in long waves, one dark as raven's feathers, one burnished like copper. In the sun, the last pale and glinting gold like the wheat fields of his childhood. They regarded him with eyes as strange and striking as their stature. The dark-haired one's gaze was sharp and mistrustful, narrowing as though to measure the worth of the intruder before her. The copper-haired woman's eyes held quiet sorrow, watching him not with suspicion but with the weariness of one who had lost much and expected to lose again. And the fair-haired one, though she too towered like her sisters, watched him with a flicker of curiosity, the faintest tilt of a smile that made his chest tighten despite himself. Caleb removed his hat slowly, the brim shadowing his worn face. "Name's Caleb Harris," he said, his voice rough from days of travel. "This here land, it's mine now. I bought it fair with deed and seal. Didn't expect to find it occupied." The dark-haired woman took one step forward, and the boards of the porch creaked under her weight. Her voice was low, resonant, carrying the kind of authority Caleb had only ever heard in seasoned sheriffs or battle-hardened captains. "And yet here we are. We live here, and we don't take kindly to men claiming it out from under us." Her words hung sharp in the air. Caleb felt the tension coil in his stomach. This was not what he had planned, not the quiet start he had dreamed of. Still, he straightened his back, steadying himself against the force of her stare. "I ain't here to steal what's yours. I've got the papers. But if there's some mistake, best we sort it like neighbors, not enemies." For a long moment, none of them spoke. The copper-haired woman's eyes softened, though her mouth stayed firm. The fair-haired one tilted her head, studying him as if he were some curious creature that had wandered into their path. Then she laughed, a low, surprising laugh that rolled like distant thunder. "Neighbors," she repeated, her voice carrying both amusement and challenge. "You might find that life out here doesn't make neighbors so easily." Caleb's horse shifted uneasily beneath him, ears flicking back. He could feel the weight of the three women's presence pressing down on him, their size and mystery, stirring whispers of unease in his mind. Who were they? Why had the seller not spoken of them? And what kind of life had carved such strength, such sorrow, into their faces? Before he could frame another question, the sound of a rifle cracked, in the distance. The bullet struck the dirt a few feet from Caleb's horse, spraying dust into the air. He twisted in the saddle, hand reaching instinctively for the revolver at his hip. On the far ridge, silhouettes moved. 3, maybe 4 men, mounted and armed. Outlaws by the look of them. The dark-haired woman's eyes flashed. Without hesitation, she barked an order to her sisters. "Inside, now!" But instead of retreating, the women moved with startling swiftness. The copper-haired one ducked into the house, emerging with a long rifle almost as tall as she was. The fair-haired woman leapt from the porch with a speed that made the ground quake beneath her boots, moving to untie horses from the post as if preparing for a fight. And the dark-haired one, still standing firm, lifted her chin toward Caleb, her voice carrying the weight of command. "You came here to claim this land, then claim it, fight for it, or ride away now and don't return." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He had come for peace, for soil and sweat and quiet days. Instead, he had found 3 strangers of impossible stature, a mystery steeped in sorrow and strength, and a gang of outlaws bearing down on them. The wind whipped hard across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder and the taste of choices that could not be undone. And in that moment, standing on the thin line between past and future, Caleb realized that whatever story had begun on this land, it was far larger, far stranger, and far more dangerous than anything he had bargained for. Whispers on the wind, the sharp crack of another rifle split the morning air, echoing across the empty plains like a thunderclap. Caleb's horse reared, eyes rolling white, but he yanked the reins tight and steadied the animal with practiced ease. Dust rose around him where the bullet had struck, close enough to remind him of the outlaw's aim, but not yet close enough to kill. He tasted the grit of earth on his tongue, felt the familiar tension in his hand as it brushed the worn grip of his revolver. He had faced gunfire before, back alley brawls in cattle towns, ambushes on the trail, skirmishes where men died for less than the price of a bottle of whiskey. But this was different. He had come here seeking peace, not another war. Yet standing there, 3 towering women at his side, he realized there was no turning back. This land was contested ground, and he was already bound to it by more than just a deed in his pocket. The copper-haired woman leveled her rifle with a steadiness that spoke of long practice. The barrel gleamed in the sunlight, her finger tightening on the trigger. "They won't stop," she said, her voice low but firm, carrying just enough sadness to suggest this was not the first time raiders had circled their home. "They've been watching us for weeks, waiting." The fair-haired woman had drawn up the horses, leading them to the side of the house for cover. Her strength was evident in the way she dragged a panicked gelding by its reins as if it weighed no more than a stubborn mule. She looked at Caleb with a grin that was half daring, half reckless joy. "Well, stranger, you gonna draw that iron on your hip or just sit there thinking about it?" Her words struck him harder than the outlaw bullets. He had not meant to step into their fight, but every instinct told him that if he rode away now, he would never shake the shame of it. He slid from his saddle, boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud, and pulled his revolver free. "I'll stand," he said quietly, more to himself than to them. The dark-haired woman gave him a long, unreadable look. Her jaw was set, her eyes cold, but something flickered there. Approval, perhaps, or calculation. Without a word, she moved toward the corner of the porch, kneeling with the ease of a soldier and drawing a long-barreled pistol from a holster strapped across her back. Caleb noticed how naturally they worked as a unit, as if they had been born to fight together. There was no panic, no wasted motion, only the kind of focus one saw in those who had lived too long on the edge of violence. The outlaws crested the ridge, 4 riders silhouetted against the bright sky. Dust churned beneath their horses, hooves, rifles gleaming in the sunlight. Caleb could hear their whoops and curses, the harsh laughter of men who believed the land belonged to anyone bold enough to seize it. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man in a black duster, raised his arm and pointed toward the farmhouse. "There," he shouted, his voice carrying across the wind. "Drive 'em out. The place is ours." The copper-haired woman fired first. Her shot rang out, the recoil jarring her shoulder, and one of the riders pitched sideways in his saddle before tumbling into the dust. The others cursed, spurring their mounts into a hard gallop. Caleb raised his revolver, steadying his hand. With a deep breath, the crack of his gun joined the chorus, and another outlaw's horse screamed, rearing back as its rider toppled. The dark-haired woman moved with deadly precision, her pistol spitting fire as she crouched low. A third rider slumped forward, gripping his side, but his horse carried him past the fence line before he toppled off. Only the leader remained, riding hard, his black coat snapping like wings in the wind. He raised his rifle, firing wildly as he charged. Caleb felt the air whistle past his ear as a bullet struck the porch post. Splinters stung his cheek, but he kept his aim steady. He fired again, his revolver bucking, and the outlaw's rifle flew from his grip. The man cursed, veering his horse away at the last moment, circling out of range with a glare full of promises he intended to keep. The sudden silence after the gunfire was deafening. Dust hung in the air, glowing like smoke in the rising sun. Caleb lowered his revolver slowly, his breath harsh in his throat. 2 men lay dead in the distance, another groaned where he had fallen, and the leader's silhouette was already fading beyond the ridge. The copper-haired woman exhaled shakily, lowering her rifle. "They'll be back," she murmured. "Men like that don't forgive. They gather more and they come harder the next time." Caleb holstered his revolver, his eyes fixed on the ridge where the outlaw had vanished. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had bought this land with the dream of a quiet life, but it was clear now that the land carried blood in its soil and shadows on its walls. When he turned back, the 3 women stood together, their faces lit by the pale morning light. They were formidable, giants strong as oak and fierce as the wind. Yet beneath that strength he saw something else. Fatigue, perhaps, or a loneliness carved deep by years of hardship. The fair-haired one stepped forward, brushing dust from her hands. She tilted her head at Caleb, her smile returning, though her eyes were sharp. "You shoot well for a man who said he came looking for peace." Caleb gave a dry chuckle, though his chest was still tight. Peace don't last long on the frontier, not when men like that roam free. He paused, then asked the question that had been burning since the moment he first saw them. "Who are you? Why are you here? 3 women alone on a farm, half the town thinks abandoned?" The sisters exchanged a look, silent words passing between them. It was the dark-haired one who finally spoke, her voice low, even but edged with steel. "We are not alone because we chose it. We are alone because no one dares stand with us. No one but fools, or men too stubborn to turn away." Her gaze held his unflinching, as if weighing his soul. Caleb felt something shift inside him. Curiosity tangled with unease, and beneath it all, a spark of something he had not felt in years. Purpose. The wind stirred around them, carrying the faint echo of distant hoofbeats, the whisper of danger not yet finished. And in that uneasy silence, Caleb understood that whatever story he had stepped into, he could not walk away now, not without knowing the truth of the 3 strange women who had claimed this land before him. The storm and the fire, the prairie, seemed unnervingly quiet after the gunfight, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Caleb stood with his hat in his hand, the smell of gunpowder still clinging to his clothes, the echoes of gunfire ringing faintly in his ears. The outlaws had ridden off, but the memory of their leader's burning eyes haunted him. He knew men like that didn't quit. They regrouped, they waited, and they came back harder. He had seen it in Texas cattle wars and Kansas range disputes. Greed was a fire that always came searching for more to consume. But for the moment, there was silence. The three women moved about the yard with a calm efficiency that unsettled him. They dragged the wounded outlaw across the dirt without hesitation, leaving his groans unanswered. They checked the fence line for damage, watered the horses, and gathered scattered tools as if battle were nothing new to them. Caleb watched, his revolver heavy in its holster, trying to understand who they really were. Finally, the copper-haired woman approached him, her rifle still cradled in her arms. Up close, he could see the lines at the corners of her eyes, the calluses on her hands, signs of a life spent in labor, in defense, in survival. She looked at him with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence he had just witnessed. "You did not have to stay," she said softly. "But you did." Caleb shifted his weight, uncomfortable under her gaze. "Didn't seem right to ride off and leave you three to it. This land, it's mine now too. That makes it my fight." Her eyes softened further, but she said nothing more, only inclined her head in quiet acknowledgement before turning back toward the house. The fair-haired sister followed soon after, brushing stray strands of golden hair from her face, her smile returning with that reckless edge. "Well, stranger," she drawled, "seems you might not be entirely useless after all. Perhaps you'll last here longer than the others." Caleb frowned, catching on the last word. "The others?" Her smile faltered, and in that instant he caught a glimpse of something raw beneath her bravado. She opened her mouth to speak, but the dark-haired sister cut in sharply from the porch, her voice like iron striking stone. "Enough." The fair-haired one fell silent at once, her grin dimming, and Caleb's questions tightened like reins in his throat. Whoever they were, whatever history haunted this land, it was not something they would reveal easily. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather on the horizon. Heavy, dark, and swollen with the weight of a coming storm, they rolled across the sky with a speed that sent whispers racing through the prairie grass. The wind shifted, sharp and cold, carrying with it the metallic tang of rain yet to fall. Caleb felt the change in the air deep in his bones. Storms on the plains were not to be taken lightly. The women moved quickly, securing shutters, driving the livestock into the barn, hauling water from the well. Caleb joined them, rolling up his sleeves and working shoulder to shoulder with them, though he found himself often pausing to marvel at their strength. The fair-haired one hefted a sack of grain that would have taken two men to lift, slinging it over her shoulder with a laugh. The copper-haired sister steadied a spooked horse with one hand while closing the barn door with the other. Even the dark-haired woman, silent and stern, moved with a power that made Caleb feel small, though not in a way that bred resentment, more in a way that sparked awe. By the time the first drops of rain struck the dust, they had gathered in the house. The storm came down with a sudden fury, wind howling like a chorus of lost souls, rain hammering against the roof in waves. The fire in the hearth sputtered at first, then caught strong as copper hair fed it with seasoned logs. The four of them sat within the dim glow of the flames, the sound of the storm pressing hard against the walls. For a time they said nothing. Caleb stared into the fire, the heat warming his weary limbs, his mind restless with questions. At last it was the fair-haired woman who broke the silence. "You're wondering," she said, her voice softer now, stripped of bravado. "Wondering what we are, why we live here alone, why the town keeps its distance." Caleb looked up, meeting her eyes. The flames painted gold across her hair, shadows dancing over her strong features. "I'd be lying if I said otherwise." The copper-haired sister placed a hand gently on her sibling's arm, as if to caution her. But the fair-haired woman only smiled, though it was tinged with sadness this time. "We are not ordinary, stranger, we never have been. This land, it draws people like you, men with deeds and dreams. They come, thinking they can own it, thinking they can tame it. But the land has a way of testing men, Most don't last. Caleb frowned, leaning forward. And you? You three. How have you lasted? The fair-haired one opened her mouth to answer, but again the dark-haired sister cut her off, her voice firm. That is not for him to know, not yet. Her words carried finality, the kind that silenced questions before they were fully formed. Caleb leaned back, frustration prickling at him, but he knew better than to push. Trust, if it was to grow, would come slow on this ground. The storm raged into the night, the wind shrieking through the eaves, lightning splitting the sky outside the shuttered windows. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, casting its glow on four figures bound together not by choice but by necessity. Caleb sat with his back against the wall, listening to the rhythm of the rain and the steady breathing of the women who had drifted into uneasy sleep. And as the storm carried on, he could not shake the feeling that he was caught in something far greater than himself. A story older than his deed, older than the farmhouse itself. The land whispered secrets in the thunder, and though he could not yet understand them, he knew they would not remain hidden forever. For in the heart of the storm, with firelight flickering across their strange, powerful faces, Caleb realized he was not merely fighting for soil and wood. He was fighting for something deeper, something tangled in mystery and blood and the fierce, unyielding will of three women who had already claimed this land as their own, and whatever truths they carried, whatever storms had shaped them, he knew the day was coming when those secrets would be laid bare, whether he was ready for them or not. Blood in the dust dawn broke red the next morning, the sky streaked with colors that looked more like fire than sunlight. Caleb stood on the porch, arms folded across his chest, watching the horizon with a tension coiled tight in his gut. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the land scrubbed clean, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of waiting, the kind that settles in a man's chest when he knows trouble is coming. He hadn't slept much. The storm had rattled the shutters, the fire had burned low, and the three women had kept to themselves in the dim light, speaking little. Caleb had drifted in and out of restless half-dreams, visions of hoofbeats thundering across the plain and the outlaw leader's cold eyes flashing in the dark. When he woke, sweat clung to his shirt despite the chill. He had lived through enough frontier fights to know when an enemy was not finished, and that man in the black duster had ridden off with a promise in his glare. The copper-haired woman stepped out beside him now, her rifle slung across her shoulder, her eyes scanning the same horizon. She said nothing at first, only breathed, in the cool air, but Caleb could feel the weight of her thoughts pressing against his own. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but certain. They will return. Caleb nodded grimly. And when they do, it won't just be four of them. She looked at him then, her gaze steady, sorrow lingering in her eyes like an old bruise. We've held this place before. We'll hold it again. But the fight always takes more than it gives. Her words struck something deep in him. He wanted to ask how many times they had stood here, waiting for violence to come riding out of the dust. He wanted to ask who they had lost, what scars they carried that made their strength seem both natural and unnatural all at once. But the questions stayed locked in his throat. He had learned enough to know the answers would not come easy. By midday, the tension broke. A low drumbeat rose on the wind, the pounding of hooves, many more this time. Caleb felt it through the ground before he heard it, a vibration that rattled the boards beneath his boots. The fair-haired sister appeared at his side, her grin sharp and reckless as ever, though her eyes betrayed the truth. She was not fearless, only unwilling to show fear. Well, she said, rolling her shoulders as though preparing for a dance. Looks like your quiet little farm just got lively again. The dark-haired woman emerged from the barn, her pistol holstered at her hip, her expression grim. Inside, she ordered, her voice clipped. We'll make our stand from the house. Caleb hesitated, looking at the sagging fences, the exposed yard. You sure about that? A house can become a coffin if they box us in. Her eyes met his, sharp as flint. Then we make sure it's theirs, not ours. The three sisters moved with practiced precision, barring the windows, stacking firewood as cover, loading rifles and checking ammunition. Caleb found himself drawn into their rhythm, his hands working without thought, hauling water, setting, spare rounds within reach, bracing the front door with a heavy beam. He had fought beside men before, but never like this. These women moved as one, their strength and resolve so unshakable that it pulled him into their current. He was no longer a stranger with a deed in his pocket. He was part of their defense, bound by necessity, and though he would not admit it, by something deeper stirring in his chest. The sound of riders grew louder until the yard filled with dust. A dozen men or more surrounded the farmstead, their horses snorting, their rifles glinting. At their head rode the outlaw in the black duster, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his eyes fixed on the house with the cold certainty of a man who intended to claim it or die trying. He reined his horse, raising his voice above the restless snorts of the herd. "You've got no right to this land," he shouted. "Hand it over and maybe we let you walk away with your skins." From the window, the fair-haired sister laughed, the sound bright and biting as lightning. "Come and take it, coward. We'll see how many of your men are eager to die for another." Man's greed. The outlaw's face darkened, and with a sharp gesture his riders fanned out, rifles raised. Caleb crouched beside the window, revolver in hand, his heart hammering. The first shots cracked through the air, shattering the stillness, splintering the wooden siding. Glass fell from a window, scattering across the floor like ice. The women returned fire instantly, their rifles thundering, each shot measured and merciless. The copper-haired woman's aim was steady, dropping a rider clean from his saddle with her first bullet. The fair-haired one reloaded with rapid speed, her grin feral as she fired again and again. The dark-haired sister moved like shadow and steel, her pistol spitting fire as she struck down another man who dared too close. Caleb fired through the smoke, his revolver bucking, striking a man from his horse with a shot that sent blood spraying into the dust. The yard became chaos, horses screaming, men shouting, bullets tearing splinters from the walls. The air was thick with smoke and grit, the acrid taste of gunpowder clinging to Caleb's tongue. He felt the old rhythm return, the grim clarity of battle where every second stretched long and sharp. But here, fighting shoulder to shoulder with these strange women, he felt something else, a fierce resolve that was not his alone. It belonged to all of them, woven together in defiance of the men who sought to take what was not theirs. The outlaws pressed harder, circling, firing from every angle. The house shook with each impact, boards splitting, shingles raining down. Caleb's hand stung from the heat of his revolver, his ears rang with the relentless thunder. Yet through it all, the sisters did not falter. Their strength was more than flesh and bone. It was something elemental, as though the storm from the night before still burned inside them. At last, the black duster outlaw spurred his horse forward, riding dangerously close, firing into the windows with wild fury. Caleb leaned out, taking aim, but before he could pull the trigger, the dark-haired sister rose beside him. Her pistol barked once, sharp and final, and the outlaw tumbled backward from his saddle, his coat flaring like wings as he struck the dirt. For a heartbeat, the battle froze. The remaining riders stared in shock, their leader sprawled in the dust, blood dark against the pale morning light. Then with curses and shouts, they turned their horses, fleeing across the plain in a storm of dust. Silence fell heavy once more, broken only by the crackle of firewood still smoldering in the hearth. Caleb lowered his revolver, his chest heaving, sweat streaking his brow. Around him the women stood strong, their weapons lowered but their eyes still blazing. The fair-haired sister laughed breathlessly, brushing her hair back from her face. "Well," she said, her grin flashing. "Seems you're not just a farmer after all." Caleb looked out at the bodies strewn across the yard, at the blood seeping into his soil, and felt the weight of what had just transpired. This was no longer just about a deed or a farm. He had bled for this land, fought beside women who carried secrets in their eyes, and in doing so, he had crossed a line he could never step back over. The dark-haired sister holstered her pistol with a slow, deliberate motion. She looked at him then, her gaze piercing, her words low and final. "Now you're bound to us." This land is not just yours. It's ours. And the price of holding it has only just begun. And in that moment, with blood still fresh in the dust and smoke curling into the sky, Caleb knew she was right. Whatever past had shaped these women, whatever truths they carried, he was tied to them now, by survival, by battle, and by something he could not yet name but felt burning fierce in his chest. The storm and the vow, the wind howled across the plains like a chorus of angry spirits, rattling the shutters of John's farmhouse until the whole structure seemed to tremble on its foundations. A storm had rolled in from the mountains with little warning, dark clouds smothering the moonlight and casting the land into a shifting, restless shadow. Inside, John sat at the table with a lantern flickering weakly before him, his hat tossed. Aside, his hands gripping a mug of black coffee he no longer bothered to drink. He was not a man who spooked easily, but tonight he felt the press of something heavier than weather alone. The women had been restless since morning. Clara, usually the calm center of the three, had spoken of a dream that haunted her. A dream of fire, horses screaming, and the farm swallowed whole by flames. Eliza had paced the floorboards like a caged animal, muttering that storms brought more than rain. They brought omens. And Martha, quiet. Martha had clutched John's arm with a grip so fierce he could feel it hours later, her eyes glassy as though she had glimpsed something none of them could see. John had laughed it off at first, told them that storms came and went, and that fear was no use to anyone on the frontier. But as the thunder cracked above the roof and the rain hammered down like 1,000 tiny fists, even he began to wonder if the storm was not merely weather, but a warning. Just as he thought to speak, the door swung open, slamming against the wall with the force of the wind. A figure staggered inside, soaked through, his boots caked in mud, his eyes wild with panic. "They're comin'," he gasped, collapsing to his knees. John recognized him at once. Amos Dillard, a neighbor who lived 2 miles north. Amos was no stranger to hardship, but never had John seen such terror in the man's face. "Bandits," Amos croaked. "Outlaws. 20. Or more. They lit my barn, shot my cattle. They're heading this way." The room froze. Clara dropped the ladle she had been holding, its clang swallowed by the storm. Eliza drew in a sharp breath, her hand drifting instinctively to the hunting rifle propped against the wall. Martha pressed her palm to her lips, her shoulders trembling. John rose slowly, the weight of his decision already pressing on him. In the Old West, you did not wait for trouble to pass. You faced it, or you perished. John turned to the women. "We've got little time," he said, his voice steady though. His heart thundered as loud as the storm outside. "They'll be here before dawn. They won't just take the farm, they'll take everything, maybe even lives." His words hung heavy, but none of the women flinched. Instead, they drew closer, their towering frames casting long shadows across the lantern light. Clara placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch firm and certain. "Then we fight," she said. Together they moved quickly, gathering what weapons they had. Rifles, pistols, even the iron poker from the fireplace. Every tool of defense was brought forth. John could not help but marvel at their resolve. These women, so mysterious in their origin, so unlike anyone he had ever known, stood with a strength that made his own courage grow. Eliza was the first to load her rifle, snapping the chamber shut with practiced ease. "If they think we'll bow, they're mistaken," she muttered, her jaw set like stone. Martha, though quieter, moved with purpose, tying back her hair and fetching lanterns to light the yard. Clara, calm as ever, began arranging barricades near the windows, her voice soft but commanding as she directed the others. The hours crawled, like years. The storm raged on as though heaven itself was at war, and in its fury, the farmhouse became a fortress. John stood by the door, his rifle ready, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. He felt fear, yes, but more than that, he felt the bond that had been forged between him and these 3 women. They were no longer strangers sharing a farm. They were bound by something deeper, something forged in fire and storm. As midnight passed, Amos stirred from where he had collapsed. His voice was weak, but his warning clear. "They'll come hungry and for blood. Men like that don't leave survivors." John nodded grimly. The words were true enough. He had faced outlaws before, men who had traded their souls for greed and cruelty. There was no bargaining with such men, only survival. At last, just as the storm began to ease, the sound came, hooves pounding through the mud, shouts cutting through the night. Lanterns flickered in the distance like fireflies, and the smell of smoke drifted on the wind. John's chest tightened, but his grip on the rifle never wavered. Behind him, he could hear Clara whisper a prayer, Eliza whisper a curse, and Martha whisper his name. The first outlaw emerged from the shadows, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, his pistol gleaming in the lamplight. He called out to the farmhouse, his voice mocking and cruel. "Come out, farmer. Give us what's ours and maybe we'll let you live." His words were met with silence, the kind of silence that carries defiance. John glanced at the women, and in their eyes he saw not fear, but fire. Whatever secrets they carried, whatever past had brought them here, they were united now in one vow. They would not bow, they would not break, and they would not surrender the life they had built together on this lonely farm at the edge of the world. When John stepped to the window, raised his rifle, and fired the first shot into the night, the battle for the farm began, a storm on the horizon. The high plains had always been unforgiving, but in recent weeks the land seemed to grow meaner by the day. Dust rode the wind like ash from a dying fire, and the skies brewed storms that came sudden and violent. For Elias, the ranch he had fought to tame was no longer simply a home. It had become a battleground for both his heart and his future. Each morning he awoke to the creak of the windmill, the smell of horses in the corral, and the voices of the 3 towering women who had, against all reason, carved a place into his life. Margaret, ever practical and fierce, could often be found hammering fence posts into the rocky soil, with a strength that made seasoned ranch hands stare in awe. Clara, with her stormy eyes, moved through the ranch like a restless wind, never quite content to stand still, her laughter one moment lifting spirits, her temper the next turning the air sharp. And then there was Josephine, gentle, thoughtful Josephine, who stitched torn clothes by lamplight and read aloud from her worn Bible as if the words might keep all of them safe. But it was not safety that loomed on the horizon. Rumors had begun to seep into the valley like smoke. Outlaws, men with little to lose and less to give, had been seen riding near the border of Elias's land. Whispers told of a band led by a figure named Holt McCready, a man once a rancher himself before. Greed and bitterness had driven him to blood. Holt had a way of picking on those who stood alone, and Elias, for all his grit, was still just one man with 3 unusual companions whose strength might invite mockery, or worse. One evening, after a long day of branding calves, Elias sat with the women around the crackling fire in the ranch house. The windows rattled from a brewing storm, but the true storm lay in the words unspoken between them. "We can't ignore it," Margaret said, her voice low but steady. "McCready's men will come here. It's not a matter of if, but when. They'll see what we've built, and they'll want to take it." Clara's jaw clenched and she slammed her hand against the wooden table so hard the lanterns shuddered. "Let them try. I've seen men like that before, cowards who prey on fear. They'll learn we're not the easy pickings they think." Her voice carried the kind of fire that could stir armies, but Elias saw the shadow behind her eyes. Fear was there too, lurking behind the bravado. Josephine reached across the table and placed her hand over Elias's, her touch soft yet grounding. "Violence leaves scars that don't heal, Elias. We've all carried enough of those already. But maybe this land was never meant to be kept without a fight. Maybe it tests us the way God tests his children." Her words hung heavy in the air, more sermon than comfort, but they resonated with each of them. The storm outside broke then, sheets of rain hammering the roof, thunder rolling like the hooves of 1,000 wild horses. And as the lightning lit the valley, Elias knew that Josephine was right. The land had tested them since the first day they'd set foot on it, tested their resolve, their hearts, their willingness to suffer for something greater than themselves. The days that followed became a blur of preparation. Fences were mended, rifles cleaned, horses trained to ride at a moment's notice. The women worked beside Elias with tireless determination, their size and strength no longer something strange to be whispered about, but a blessing, a gift forged for a moment such as this. Clara taught Elias how to move swiftly in the saddle, her towering frame steady even as the Mustang beneath her bucked and kicked. Margaret oversaw the stacking of supplies, her every order sharp, precise, as though she'd commanded armies before. Josephine kept the hearth warm and the spirits calm, her hymns filling the long nights when the weight of what might come threatened to crush them. Yet even in their labors, there was tenderness. One dusk, after the last of the cattle had been herded in, Elias stood with Margaret on the porch. She leaned against the railing, her height casting her above him. Yet in her silence he saw a rare vulnerability. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if this us is too strange a dream to last? A lone man and 3 women who don't belong anywhere else. Perhaps the world won't let us keep it." Elias's answer was quiet but sure. "Dreams are only strange until someone makes them real. We've already done that, Margaret. No one can take it from us unless we let them." Her lips curved into a rare smile, brief but brighter than any sunrise. She said nothing more, but the look she gave him was one Elias carried into the restless night. By the week's end, the threat arrived not as a whisper but a roar. From the hills came riders, black shapes against the horizon, their laughter carried on the wind. Holt McCready himself led them, his long coat whipping behind him, his voice booming like thunder as he called out for Elias to face him. "You think you can tame this land with 3 freakish women and a handful of cattle?" he jeered. "It ain't yours and it never will be. Hand it over, or we'll take it with fire and lead." The valley seemed to hold its breath. Elias stepped forward, rifle in hand, the women flanking him like sentinels carved from stone. The fear he had carried melted into something else, resolve, steady and unbreakable. The homestead behind them was more than wood and nails. It was hope, stitched together with sweat, love, and defiance. And in that charged silence, as the outlaws shifted impatiently on their horses, Elias knew that everything, the land, the women, his very soul, would be decided in the storm about to break. The farm of giants. The storm passed, but the memory of it lingered on like smoke after a gunfight. Jonathan woke to the golden light of dawn pouring through the cracks of the cabin shutters. His body ached, not from battle, but from the restless night spent listening to the prairie winds howl around them. In that silence which followed, the farm seemed different, almost sacred, as though the violence of nature had stripped away every lie, every mask, leaving only truth behind. He rose quietly, stepping outside to find the 3 giant women already awake. They were tending to the horses, their large frames moving with a grace he had come to recognize as uniquely theirs. Mary knelt by the corral, her enormous hands stroking the mane of his chestnut mare with surprising tenderness. Eliza was carrying buckets of water from the creek, her long strides cutting across the yard like the deliberate pace of a queen inspecting her kingdom. And Clara, gentle Clara, was hanging freshly washed linen on a line, the white sheets billowing, in the cool morning air like flags of surrender. Jonathan felt a pang of humility as he watched them. Once he had believed he was the master of this farm, that by purchasing the land he had somehow earned ownership over everything on it. But the truth was plain. These women were the farm. They had tilled its soil, fought for its survival, and carved out a life in a land that wanted to break them. He was not their master. He was, perhaps for the first time, their partner. Yet even as that thought settled in, the weight of the future pressed heavily upon him. The world outside their farm was not blind, and it was not kind. Neighbors whispered. Travelers stared. A sheriff who had ridden by days earlier had given Jonathan a look that lingered too long, a look filled with suspicion. There were rumors about giant women who lived north of town, and rumors had a way of growing sharper than knives. Later that morning, they gathered in the cabin to share a meal. Jonathan looked at them, Mary's fierce jawline, Eliza's searching eyes, Clara's warm smile. and he could not hold back the words that had been gnawing at him since the storm. "We cannot go on hiding," he said softly, laying down his fork. "People will come. They will want to drive you out or worse. This land is cruel to those it does not understand." Mary leaned forward, her hands curling into fists on the table. "Let them come. I have fought before. I will fight again. No one will take this place from me." Eliza shook her head, her voice calm but steady. "Violence will only bring more violence. We cannot keep living like shadows. Sooner or later, someone must stand in the open and tell the world the truth. That we are not monsters, not curses. We are women. We are flesh and blood." Clara's voice broke the silence, tender but firm. "We are more than that. We are a family now. And families do not survive by fighting each other. They survive by holding together no matter what comes." Jonathan felt the weight of her words. Yes, they were a family, and families in the West had to stand like fortresses, weathering storms, outlaws, and hunger alike. But could a fortress stand against a world that would never understand giants, walking among them? The days that followed were filled with uneasy peace. They worked the land together, planting corn and mending fences. Jonathan taught Clara how to shoot his rifle. Mary showed him how to swing an axe in rhythm with his breath. Eliza sat with him at night, speaking in low tones about her dreams of a world where she might walk freely down a dusty main street without stairs, without fear. Then one evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, a rider appeared on the edge of the farm. Dust rose behind his horse, his badge catching the light of the dying day. The sheriff had returned. Jonathan stepped forward, his heart pounding, but before he could speak, the sheriff's eyes moved past him, falling on the women standing tall and unflinching behind him. His jaw tightened. "So the stories are true?" the sheriff said slowly. "Giant women on a farm living with a man who claims the land is his. The town won't like this. People are already talking." Mary's hand twitched toward the axe by the woodpile, but Jonathan raised a hand to stop her. He took a deep breath, his voice steady though his chest thundered. "Sheriff," he said, "these women are no danger. They are my family. They work this land as hard as any soul you'll find in the territory. We harm no one, we ask for nothing but peace. If the town has a quarrel with me, let them bring it to me, but leave these women be." The sheriff studied him for a long, heavy moment. Then he tipped his hat and muttered, "Families like yours have a way of stirring trouble. But trouble or not, the West has room enough for those who can hold their ground. I'll tell the town you're just farmers. The rest is up to you." And with that he turned his horse and rode away, leaving only the echo of hoofbeats behind. That night, under a sky bursting with stars, Jonathan sat with the three women outside the cabin. No one spoke for a long while. The silence was not fear, nor tension, but something deeper, acceptance. "We will face whatever comes," Jonathan said finally, his hand finding Clara's, then Mary's, then Eliza's. Together, Mary gave a rare smile, fierce and proud. Eliza's eyes shone with quiet resolve. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, her touch as gentle as the prairie wind. They were an unlikely family, bound not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the sheer will to endure. In the harsh and unforgiving West, such bonds were rarer than gold and stronger than steel. And as the night deepened, Jonathan realized that the farm was no longer simply a piece of land he had bought. It was a sanctuary, a place where love could grow wild, where giants could walk unashamed, where a broken man could find redemption. The West would whisper its stories, and rumors would spread. But on that farm, under that vast and endless sky, they had carved out a truth that no gossip could erase. They were a family, and nothing, no storm, no sheriff, no world beyond the horizon, could take that away.